Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over some exercises and problem sets for filters using arrays. Super excited to get into this. Let's get right into it. Okay, so to start, as with all the previous exercise videos, I've created a kind of snippet at the top of each of these exercise files. What we're going to do is kind of read through them together. I'll give you a few moments to try it out yourself, and then we'll go through the solution as a group. So for this first one, just a warm up to get our hands kind of warmed up and ready to go. We want to create an array called practice with the numbers 10 to 20 inclusive. Then we want to create another array using filter that keeps the even numbers in practice. And finally, we want to print out both practice and the new filtered array. Go ahead and give that a shot yourself, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so to start, let's create an array. In this case, oh my gosh, can't spell, practice. And we want this to be an array with the numbers 10 to 20 inclusive. So we can do 10, 20, it's not 8 to 10 to 20 inclusive, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. Apologize for the super boring watching me type out 20 numbers there. You might be wondering, is there a better way to actually do this? And yes, there definitely is. However, we'll leave that for future videos just so that we can keep it simple for now and focus on filter. Okay, so that's step one complete. Step two, create another array using filter that keeps the even numbers in practice. So I need to say a name for this. Let's just call it evens, events, evens. And we're going to take practice and we're going to do the dot filter function on practice. And again, filter only works on arrays. We can only do dot filter if the thing on the left hand side of the dot is an array. So it's a method on the array objects, which we'll actually get more practice with as we learn objects and other things like classes in the future. So that said, filter takes a single argument, and that's going to be a function. Oh dear, I shared. That said, filter takes a single argument, and this is going to be a function. In this case, I'll put an arrow function. And the arrow function takes several parameters actually. However, we'll deal with the first one and we'll kind of Google it if we need any more in the future. But for this one, we should be fine with the first parameter, which is going to be the item. So in this case, we know their numbers, so I'll just say num to make it nice and short. So we're going to get each number, and num is going to be 10, then it's going to be 11, 12, etc., all the way to 20. Each loop, basically, you think of for filter. Now, we want to keep the even numbers, and we want to filter out or get rid of or discard the odd numbers. So filter, if you recall from the previous video where we looked at how filter works, we want it to return either true or false, right? Depending on whether we want to keep the item or filter it out, right? True and false respectively. So in this case, we want to return true if it's even. So how do we ask if something is even? We can say if the number that we're looking at, mod 2, is equal to exactly 0, then this is even, right? And we want to, in this case, return true. Otherwise, we want to return false. Don't forget this return false part. In the previous video, we saw why this is technically not necessary in this particular example, where we return undefined if we don't return false explicitly. However, as I mentioned, that's not only going to make me sad, but also your future self sad if you come to look at this code, or even your people that you work with doing the same code base. It would just get them very confused, because if you don't have explicit returns in a filter, it's very confusing to figure out where things return true or false, or what it's actually returning every single loop. So in this case, we can definitively say if it's even, return true. If it's, in this case, not even, basically, then return false. And we can save this. And then we can finally console log out both of these, practice, and we can console log out, what did I call it? Evens. Perfect. So let me just open up my terminal. Make sure I'm in the right folder, and I am. And then I'm just going to use node, and I'll do the warm-up exercise. And this is a pretty big array, so it kind of splits it up on multiple lines here. But you can see that this is the original array, which is what's being logged out on line 19, which is practice. And then on line 20, we're getting evens printed out, which is only the even numbers, which is 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20, which is the correct answer. Perfect. Okie dokie. Let's go to exercise 1. So for this one, again, I'll read it out and then I'll give you a chance to try it out. So we want to create an array called countries with the following booleans. Oh, no, not booleans, following strings. Sorry about that. These are going to have 5 strings in it, which are each countries, France, South Africa, Brazil, United States, and Sweden. Okay. Second step, we want to filter over countries and keep only the countries that have a blank space in their name. So examples of this in this particular array are South Africa and United States, right? Because there's a space kind of like right here in the middle of their names. So they're 2 words or more words. And then we want to print out both of these. So for the hint for this, I want you to Google for JavaScript string contains or something along those lines, just to see how you can actually look for a space character in a string. And remember, a space is different from an empty string, just as an extra hint. So I'll give you a chance to try that out and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's start off with the countries array. So we'll say const countries, and I'm just going to copy this over here. Sorry for making you type it out. Then we want to filter over countries and keep only the countries that have a blank space, right? So we're going to do, and we want to print this out. So I know I want to store this somewhere. So I'll just say const, I don't know, blank countries, for example, just because for lack of creativity right now, I'll just go with this. And we're going to say countries.filter. And as we looked at in the warm-up, filter takes a function. In this case, I'll give it an arrow function. And we're looping through countries, plural. So we're going to get each country singular, each loop and each time around, right? So we're going to get France, South Africa, Brazil, etc. Okay, so we want to keep the countries that have a space in the name, in this case, South Africa and United States, as I mentioned, and we want to filter out the ones that don't. So France, Brazil, and Sweden. So how do we do this? So I'm going to pull up Google and I'm just going to kind of look through this process with you just so you can see how this feels, because I think it's a very, very important part of programming that's often left out. Okay, so with Google pulled up, what we want to do is search for JavaScript string contains, for example. I just made this up myself because this is kind of in English how I would Google for something like this. I want to check if a string contains something in JavaScript because we're looking to see if a string contains a space, in this case a space character, so an empty space. And I don't actually know what the method or the function is for this. Okay. And as I've mentioned several times already, my favorite documentation is MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, and they have their web documentation specifically is excellent. So I tend to kind of be biased towards looking at those. However, you can look at really any result. This one looks kind of neat. It says string prototype includes, ignore prototype for now, but this seems promising, right? Even just looking at this Google search result, the includes method performs a case-sensitive search to determine whether one string may be found in another string, returning true or I'm presuming false. So I'm just going to click on this. And look at that, I was totally right. Who would have guessed? True or false? Let me just zoom in a little bit more so you can see that a bit better. So they have an example here, right? This is one reason why MDN is also really good. Const sentence, and they have a sentence, and then the const word, right? And then they're looking to see if the sentence includes the word, right? And they have a funky way of doing this in this case, but that's actually what we want. It's just we're not looking for a word, we're looking for a single character, but that's still just a string in another string. Okay, so this looks to be kind of what we want. So we want string includes. And the way that we use this is by taking the string and then doing a dot includes and then putting the string that we're searching for, it looks like. Okay, so includes and then the search string. Looks like there's some other ways we can use this with other parameters as they kind of list out down here, but we don't want to get too fancy right now. Let's just stick with includes. So we want to ask the question, does country, right, the arguments that were being passed, does country include a blank space or not, right? So if country, singular, dot includes, and then includes takes the search string as its first argument, and we want to search for a blank space. Now this is where things get kind of tricky. If you just gave it a empty string like this is actually not a blank space. A blank space is a literal character that is actually this blank space right here. So notice how I actually have a physical space character in here, even though it looks almost blank. This is different from this, which is just an empty string, which has no characters inside, which every string technically includes, I believe. So if we put a space in here, we're asking, does country include a blank space character somewhere inside of it. And if that's true, then we want to return true, because we want to keep that item in blank countries. Otherwise, we want to return false, right? And oops, I saved that file, and my editor kind of went crazy and kind of prettified all this, but let's ignore that for now. This code remains the same, right? So just keep in mind, I have to emphasize this every single time, always return true or return false. Don't skip out on this step. Technically, in this case, we could, but because it returns undefined, which is falsy, but that is really bad coding practice because it's very confusing, especially as these filter functions get a bit more complex. So enough of me yapping, let's take a look and see if this actually works. So we'll say node exercise1.js. And oops, exercise1.js is got nothing in it. There you go. I always do this every single time. Super confused. We want to print out countries and blank countries. It's good to see you that you can see me make these errors and we can laugh about it together. Okay, so it looks like we have the right answer, right? We have countries here, and countries has all 5 countries, right? France, South Africa, Brazil, United States, and Sweden. And we asked to filter into blank countries the countries that have a space, which in this case we know is only South Africa and United States. Okay, so just to show you kind of the opposite, just for fun, just so you can see how this would work. If we wanted to do the opposite of this, we could put a not here, for example. So if the country does not include a space, and we would get the exact opposite result, just so you can see how that would work, right? So this would in English read, if country does not include a space, then return true, which means we keep it. But that was not the question, so I'll undo that and make sure that we have the right answer here for you to look at. Perfect. Let's go to the second exercise. So for this one, we want to create an array called prices with these values, these numbered values. Then we want to create another array using map called low prices. That's going to, sorry, I should say using filter, called low prices. That keeps all the prices where the price plus a 15% tax is less than 10. Okay, so what this is saying is if we were to add 15% tax to this number, is it going to be less than, in this case, I guess you could say dollars or whichever currency we're working with, right? 10 units, $10, 10 whatever currency. Right? And I can probably guess that most of these, like this one is probably going to be less. This one definitely more because it's already more. This one's already more. This one's already more. 8, I don't know. I can't do that math in my head. 15, probably less. And we can probably keep that. So we'll have at least 1.23, I think, and 5.2. 8, I'm not really sure. Can't do that math in my head right now. Maybe you can beat me at that. So let's give this a shot right after you give it a try yourself. Okay, so I'm going to say const prices, and I'm going to set it to these ones right here. Then we want to create a const low prices, and this is going to equal to prices.filter, not fill, that's a different function. And this takes a arrow function, or technically any function in this case, but we'll use an arrow function. And prices, as I've mentioned, we use a singular version just to keep it nice and simple. We have many prices, and we're going to get one price each iteration of this filter. Okay, so we want to keep the price intact and in this low prices array if the price plus 15% is less than 10. So if price plus, or I guess multiplied by 1.15. So the math for this is a little bit tricky, and there's a few ways you can do this. This is one way to ask, is the price including 15% increase? And in this case, we're going to say less than 10. Okay, so if the price multiplied by itself and an extra 15%, is that less than 10 units or 10 currency or dollars or however you want to think about it? Then we want to return true. Now notice this is a bit different from how we would use map, right? Map, we can actually manipulate the value before we kind of put it in the array, but with filter, we don't do that, right? With filter, we only ask to keep it or to get rid of it. If we wanted to use, to manipulate these values and actually add this tax, we would also have to use map, for example, and that's a future bonus exercise, which we'll get to shortly. And like I said before, if we don't return true here, then in this case, we can just return false. Okay, there might be many other cases and more complex functions, but for this one, we return true. Otherwise, if we get past that, then we return false, because that means that it's greater than 10, greater than or equal to 10. And then I won't make the same mistake as my exercise 1 and get confused with myself. I'll console log out prices and low prices here. Okay, so let me clear this out, and I'll run node and exercise 2. And we can see that we have this starting array, which is our starting array right here. And these are the prices, right? 1.2, 3, 8, and 5.2 from this prices array, where if we were to add a 15% tax, it would be less than $10. Okay? So that's the way to think about this question. Perfect. Let's go to the third exercise. So for this one, it's getting a bit trickier. We want to create an array called values. Now this array looks kind of gnarly, right? But this is an array where each element in the array is itself another array. Okay? And each array in this case has 3 numbers inside of it. Okay, so this is an array of arrays. Step 2, we want to create a new array called has2s that filters over this values array and keeps only the subarrays that have a number 2 in them. Right? So in this case, we want to keep these 2 arrays right here, the 1, 2, and 3, and the 0, 1, and 2. We want to filter out these 2 middle ones which don't have the number 2 in them. All right, and the hint for this is very similar to the string one. We want to Google for JavaScript array includes, okay, or array contained, or something like that, right? And see what you can find. Give you a moment to try that out, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's start off before we do some Googling. So we're going to say const values equals to this. Perfect, this 2-dimensional array. Then we want to create another const called has2s that is equal to taking values and filtering over it. And we're going to give this a function. And let's say that we get each value, each singular value. So I'll just keep with the trend, values and value, where each value in this case is going to be each of these subarrays. Okay, so we're going to ask the question, does this subarray, does 1, 2, 3 have the number 2 in it somewhere? Okay, and this should work for any size of array. Now, I mentioned that we could use this function. You technically can do this manually yourself using booleans and a for loop. However, I'd like you to practice with these functions because this really makes our lives easier instead of hand coding it. So let's do that. Let's pull up Google. Okay, so in Google, let's do that. Let's do an array includes JavaScript. Interestingly, it's actually called includes in JavaScript, and you can see here is my favorite resource, MDN Web Docs. Array prototype includes. Let's see if this is what we want, right? Just by not even opening it, just by looking at the result. The include method determines whether an array includes a certain value among its entries, returning true or false as appropriate. That's actually exactly what we want, which is quite fantastic. We're like, literally, this is what we want, which is awesome. So let's look into this. Let's see if they have an example. And they do. So let's say they have 1, 2, 3, which is array 1. They're asking, does array 1 dot includes the number 2? Which, funnily enough, is what we're doing. And this is apparently going to return true as its output, which is what we want, right? So let's try this out, see how it works. We're going to say if value, and remember, value is an array, right? So this is our, if you were to look at this example, array 1 is value in our case, right? Is the actual inner array. So if value dot includes, which is a method on arrays, and we can give it the, in this case, we're looking for the number 2, then we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to return false because it's not in there. Okay, and you can see when I save this, I get the nice pretty matrix formatting for my array. All right, so we want to keep this one, we want to skip this one, and then we want to keep that one. So let's print out both of these and see what we get, if this is correct or not. So if we look at values, and then we look at has twos, pull up my terminal, do node exercise 3, and this looks a little bit weird, but I'll highlight what we're looking at. So this is our first array. This is the console log on line 31 with 3 different arrays in it. And then this is our result, which is line 32 in my case, where I'm console logging our filter array has twos, which indeed has the 1, 2, 3 in it, and the 0, 1, 2, which are the only 2 subarrays that have the number 2 in it. Okay, perfect. So hopefully that makes sense. There are ways to shorten this even more, but for now we'll leave it at that, just so that we get more practice with this before doing some fancy kind of shorter syntax. Okay, so let's go to the bonus exercise. Of course I had to create a bonus for this because this is one of my favorite topics, and all of these functional programs. Every topic technically is my favorite topic, but especially these. Let's create an array called nums, and this is going to look like this: 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. Then we want to create an array called times 2 that maps over nums and returns each number multiplied by 2. Now, I didn't accidentally forget to get rid of maps in this case, but I actually meant maps for this bonus exercise. If you haven't seen maps, please refer to the previous video on where we go over maps as well as corresponding exercise video. But maps or map will allow us to manipulate an array and do this kind of thing where I mentioned before, we can actually change values around before we do something like filter, if that's what we need. So we want to do a map first in this case and create another array called times 2. Then after we do the map, we want to create another array called over 50 that filters over times 2, which is what we just created using the map, and keeps only the values that are actually over 50. And we want to print out all 3 of these arrays. Okay, so over 50 should contain these values at the end. Okay, so I'm going to let you try that out yourself really quick, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so let's start by creating nums, and nums is going to be this one here, as I mentioned, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So that's step 1. Then we want to create another array called times 2, so this is going to be times 2. And this is going to take nums, it's going to do a dot map over them, and map works the same way as filter, takes a function, and we're going to get back each thing. In this case, let's just call it num to keep it consistent with the plural and the singular. And we want to return each number multiplied by 2. That's the goal for this particular map, right? So we can simply do return num multiplied by 2. Let's see what happens here. So let's console log out nums, and then let's console log out times 2 and see what we get. Just do node, and then we'll do bonus. Fantastic. Looks like it works, right? So we have 10, 20, 30, 40 for nums, and then we have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 for the times 2, which is every single number in nums multiplied by 2, which is exactly what we want. So we have 1 and 2 done. Now, we want to do step 3, which is create another array. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, give myself some more space, called over 50 that filters over times 2 and only keeps the values greater than 50. Okay, so I'll do const over 50, and this is going to take times 2. Be careful to take times 2 and not nums that we're filtering over. So I'm going to say times 2 dot filter this time, and this signature is the same. We're going to take a function as the argument. Okay, we're going to give it a function. In this case, I'm just going to say also num because it's kind of awkward to turn this into singular if that's possible. And we want to keep the numbers that are above 50. And in this case, we want to keep 60, 80, and 100. Okay, but we want to do this dynamically. So how do we do this? If the number is greater than 50, we want to keep it. So we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to return false, right? Simple as that. So let's console log this out and see if this is actually correct. So if I run this, it looks like we get the correct answer, right? So we have nums here, then we have times 2 here on the second row, and then we're taking times 2 and we're filtering over it and only keeping the numbers over 50. Okay, Now, to really wrap this up and to get a little bit more practice, because I can't help myself, I want you to try to see if you can do this without creating an intermediary array, or two intermediate arrays in this case. So what I mean is, can you basically do this all in one statement? So we don't need to have a times 2, and we technically don't need to have an over 50. So what I want to do is, just to be super clear, I want to be able to just say const nums equals something, and I want to do like a dot map something, and then a dot filter something, and then be able to console log out nums like this, and still have the same result. All right, I want you to give that a shot and see if you can try that, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so I'm going to kind of make this a little bit bigger just so we can see how this works. It turns out that what we can do with these functions, since they're functional functions, that's hard to say, is we can chain them together. And the reason for this is that these functions actually return back to us, they evaluate to the resulting array that we're interested in. Very similar to this right here. If you think about this statement, or even this statement down here, we are taking nums, mapping over it, and returning num times 2, and we're getting back the times 2 array, and we're pointing times 2 at it, right? So times 2 is pointing at this new array, but this is actually creating that array and giving us that array in memory that we can then point to. Okay. What we can then do though is, since that is actually an array, like this literally right here is going to end up being this, right? This evaluates to this. And we know that we can do a filter on an array, right? So we can technically do dot filter and then filter this like that, right? So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to take the original array, we're going to directly map over it. We're going to immediately take that result. We're not going to store it in an intermediary variable, and we're going to filter over it. And we're going to take that result, and we're going to point nums at that filtered and mapped result. Okay, so it's like a pipeline. We're kind of processing this array, watching it go through map, immediately watching it go through filter, and then getting that result. Okay, so how is this going to work? Well, it turns out that it works the exact same way. So if I take this function right here, num, and return num times 2, and remember to copy all the curly brackets, but don't grab the actual end regular brackets. We can put that in here. And I'll just save that just so it formats nicely. Right here is the function that returns num times 2. I'm going to do the same for filter. I'm going to grab this one right here, copy it, the whole function for that we gave to filter, and paste it into here, and it's going to look like this. Okay, so if we were to walk through this, I just want to show you what this looks like before we actually, or actually translates to before we run this code. In fact, I'm going to comment this code out down here real quick just so that we don't get two printouts. So we're only doing this, and then we're logging it out to see what we get. What this is saying, if we were to read this out, is create an array with 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 in it. Immediately map through that array and multiply each number by 2. So we're going to end up with this. So at this stage, we're going to end up with this. Then immediately filter it and give me the numbers greater than 50. And then at this stage here, we're going to end up with that. Then we're going to point nums at this final result and ignore this intermediary and ignore the mapped intermediary and only grab the final filter. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. If I run this, we'll see that I actually get the final filtered array by itself after going through this entire pipeline, which is actually quite remarkable, right? This is really, really beautiful if you actually read through this code. It's very condensed. There's a lot of stuff happening in here in a very small amount of space, and arguably it's very easy to read. In fact, We can shorten this even more once we learn some of the newer functions of JavaScript so that it pretty much fits in just a couple of lines of code, right? But I won't go there right now because it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. This already by itself is quite intense if you're seeing it for the first time. I really encourage you to read through this step by step and convince yourself that yes, we start with this array, then we're mapping through it, and we're getting this array. We're not storing this anywhere, we're immediately filtering through it, then we get this array. Then we're pointing nums at that final result, and these are technically no longer in existence. Okay. So I hope those exercises were enough to get you hyped up about this topic, and they're just fun and interesting. If you found value in this video, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. As well, I'd love to hear in the comments kind of what you thought of these exercises, if you found them interesting, or if you came up with different solutions that you just like to share with me or everyone else, or even if there were any errors that you weren't able to kind of work through yourself. I'd love to help you out in there. What we're going to do in the next video is go through the final of the 3 big functional programming methods on arrays called reduce. That one is definitely a little bit gnarlier and very, very kind of feature packed. So I'm super excited to get to that one. I'll definitely see you in that video. See you later.